So over the past few days I've been reading a book called Ukraine: A History, and while I do still broadly support Ukraine and condemn the Russian invasion in the broadest possible manner, my views have nonetheless become a lot more nuanced in the topic. So again, I want to put the Russian invasion of actual proper Ukraine, mainland Ukraine in terms of Kiev and all that aside. I do condemn it for several reasons, but the main thing I want to focus on in the video is actually Luhansk, Donetsk and Crimea. Because speaking historically, probably the most interesting thing you can comment on is the fact that these regions, which for most of the conflict, going back to 2014 and before that, have actually never been owned by Ukraine up until 1991, so for 31 years. And when I say never been a part of Ukraine, I mean culturally, ethnically, linguistically, in terms of actually a state, going back millennia. In terms of Crimea in particular, Crimea has actually been held by several different powers, several different ethnicities, which include, going way back, there was Greek colonies. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire at some point. Obviously it was a part of Russia. The Mongols had it. And in terms of the actual ethnicity that was there for at least several centuries, the Tatars made up the vast majority of the population up until well into the 19th century. So for example, in 1835 they made up 83.5% of the population, whilst now they only make up 10.6% of the population. And again, if you really want to comment the conflict, especially in terms of the Donbass and Crimea, I think this is something you have to keep in mind, because a lot of people just hold the kind of view that these are just naturally a part of Ukraine, like it's an intrinsic fact. Well, again, Crimea in particular has been held by several powers over several millennia, but it's never been a part of Ukraine, or rather the Kievan Rus, as it was back then. And again, similar things can be said about the Donbass, however that was only held by the Russians and the Mongols. So it really comes to the question of who has a legitimate right to the Donbass and Crimea. If we're looking at it from a purely state perspective, a perspective of the politics of today, it would obviously be Ukraine, as this is sovereign territory. However, what you also have to keep in mind is, while these states have been held by several ethnicities over time, even today, not the vast majority of the people, but the wide majority of the people aren't Ukrainian in these states. Again, culturally, ethnically, and so. The Ukrainians only make up about twice the population of the Tatars in Crimea, with the Russians making up 2/3. And while there's, at least as far as I know, no Tatars in Luhansk or Donetsk, the Russians make up, again, a pretty broad majority in these regions as well. So it really comes to the question, if you want to look at it at a wider perspective, again, over time, ethnicities and whatnot, keeping in mind that this region has only been held by Ukraine for about 31 years, so there's absolutely no reason that the map could be redrawn. As in many other conflicts in the Middle East during the 20th century, a lot of states were drawn up rather shoddily, along ethnic lines, along religious lines, along cultural lines, which didn't make any sense, which has caused conflict. And I think you can really look at the situation in Ukraine from the exact same perspective. Obviously it's a different region entirely, different cultures entirely, but the problem is fundamentally the same with what happened in the Middle East, what happened between India and Pakistan, is that you have a nation that while maybe geographically its borders make more sense, in terms of the actual people there, the borders are completely incongruent, which is obviously going to cause conflict, where you have a very sizable Russian state, especially compared to Ukraine, next to Ukraine, with Ukraine holding several regions which for many centuries, going back 350 years, were a part of the Russian Empire and were traditionally, if not ethnically Russian, certainly not ethnically Ukraine, again, never have been, regardless of how far you go back. So in terms of the solutions of this, of course it's came far beyond this point now, but it could possibly be negotiated. I think really the wisest move would be to simply hold a vote in Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea. You could have it set up by a neutral party with Ukraine, Russia and several other powers overlooking it. So you could actually poll the people there who again are mostly ethnically Russian or non-ethnically Ukrainian, and you could simply see what side they would take. The only reason this really hasn't came to a head that Ukraine wouldn't be in favour of it is because in terms of the polls that have been done, and obviously some of these will be biased, some of these will be supported by Russia, but all the information really points to the fact that if a democratic election was held in either of these regions, they would probably either become their own independent state or a part of Russia, because they don't identify with Ukraine, which historically they've never been a part of. And even Ukraine, other than a very brief period of a few decades where there was peasant revolts, has actually also been a part of separate powers, which include all the powers that we already mentioned in terms of the Ottoman Empire, the Mongols, the Russians, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So again, I think the main point of the video would be simply that when I went into this, I was completely ignorant of Ukrainian history. Luckily I didn't say too much about the subject, but regardless, I did actively talk about it with people when I had absolutely no clue on it. I said a few ignorant opinions. And I think the lesson that can really be took is, in terms of getting interested in these conflicts, debating them online, talking to people, at the very least you should be expected to read just a single book on history. Again, I'm only 1/3 of the way through the book that I'm at on now, and it's radically changed my opinion to being completely pro-Ukrainian, to actually thinking that it'd be better for all the parties involved, Russia, Ukraine, as well as the regions that are under conflict, to actually become either independent or a part of Russia. Because again, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, historically, there's no reason for it. And like many other conflicts, these borders are completely arbitrary. There was no reason that they should have been drawn up the way they were, and it was obviously a huge mistake for all the powers involved.